Russia has won the Ukraine-Russia war, and there's nothing NATO can do to stop it. That is the headline of a piece just out just before we came on the air here in National Security Magazine, written by Harry Kazianis, who's been on our show before and probably will be again later this week. That's a very provocative title to some, because there are still a great many, both in the United States and in Europe, that will contest that. Also, and in Ukraine, that's no big surprise. But to try to decipher fact from fiction, we have the best military analyst that there is in America, Colonel Douglas McGregor, defense and foreign policy analyst, former advisor to Secretary of Defense, and a highly decorated direct combat veteran. Doug, as always, really glad to have you.
Hi, Dan. Good to be with you.
Well, let's just start off with that first, because Harry actually published another piece yesterday in the same magazine where he said that NATO would lose a war with Russia, which again, raises all these issues. And I'm going to show you some things that are directly countered by that from NATO itself. No surprise. But let's see if we can figure out who's telling the truth and who's not.
No, I think that's a legitimate question. And I think we have to give Harry credit for stating the self-evident truth. Unfortunately, truth in Washington, D.C. is neither popular nor widely discussed. We tend to live in a bubble and think whatever we like about whatever we like. But Harry's absolutely right. What people don't understand, and I listened to some discussions recently with other people who are analysts who don't seem to understand this. They're trying to explain why the Russians have moved as slowly as they have and as deliberately as they have. And I, too, had trouble with this until I understood something that I don't hear very many people talk about, and that is that President Putin always wanted from the very beginning to avoid at all costs a conflict with NATO and the United States. Unlike people in Washington and the West European capitals, he wants to live with us when the war is over. In other words, he wants to eventually have good relations with the West and with Europe, and hopefully do business with them and get past this set of events in Ukraine. So I think that's never been fully understood. And it's not because he's afraid. I mean, anyone is afraid of war. If you have any sense at all, you have reason to be afraid of any war. But it's really because he wants to be able to do business when it's over. And I think Harry is right. But when people ask him, well, how could this be? And the war drags on, and why this great and powerful Russia doesn't squash, this insect called Ukraine? Well, the answer is very simple. He doesn't want to. He doesn't want to create a set of conditions that would make it harder for Russia and the United States in particular and Europe to get along and go back to some civilized, order and exchange of views. So he's absolutely right, but I think that's the answer. The problem now is we seem to be bending over backwards, along with the West Europeans, to sort of permanently poison the waters. That's the bad news. And so he's got a lot of people pressuring him, saying, let's not waste any more time with these people. We'll never be friends. They will always be our enemy. He doesn't believe that, but he's got a lot of people around him telling him that.
Well, and in fact, that there are some indications, some of which just this morning I'll read in just a second, that because of this attack by Kiev a week or so ago against the bomber fleet up in the north, the attacks against the civilian trains in southern southern Russia, also the Kiev bridge, and then other attacks on Ingalls Air Base and some other things. Some were military, some were not, which has many of the Russians in a rage, putting more pressure on Putin to do that. Now, this is just out just a couple of hours ago, I believe. Actually 1 hour ago. This is from New Rules Geopolitics on X. And just for everybody's clarity, this is a definite pro-Russian site, but this is not one of those just reflexively, Russia's great, they actually have good analysis on there, and it has proven pretty accurate over the years. What they're saying is that last night, Russia launched a precision strike on critical Ukraine infrastructure, and the devastation is evident, but this is just the beginning. And then it goes on in a string to talk about Russia has been targeting workshops and airbase, massive fires. This is just overnight. This is the third out of 5 nights, I believe, where Russia seems to be sustaining an air campaign at large numbers. They hit a Ukrainian naval base, ship repair yards, large-scale fire at a train site. So they're actually going after the ability to move troops and equipment around, et cetera. It continues to go on. But they're saying that bottom line is that Russia may have reached a point to where, all right, we're going to take some of the gloves off. So there's been a lot of talk this week that Russia, and it may need to be later today, that Putin is going to have a meeting with his National Security Council, and some suggest that he might change this from a SMO, they call it, Special Military Operation, to a CTO, a counter-terror operation. And the significance of that is that from Russian law, that allows him to strike individuals that he deems terrorist, i.e. Zelenskyy and possibly Budanov and some of these others. How do you see that?
Well, I read the same reports, and I know that the critical infrastructure that was targeted has a war-making potential to it. In other words, they haven't hit targets that have no potential link of any kind to military power and development. So they've been very careful, although these strikes have been obviously very impressive. I think the bad news is for President Putin, and he may well understand this. I mean, obviously, I've never met the man. We've never discussed anything. I don't know anybody on the Russian general staff. But if I put myself in the position of the Russian general staff, I think I would tell President Putin, these are good targets. It's had the desired impact, but this is not going to end until we march into Kiev. And I think that's something that has to be understood. As long as this outrageous theatrical troupe called a government resides in Kiev, and they are not harmed, they are not removed, they are not driven out, this war will continue. If we've learned anything over the last, 3.5+ years, it's this. Zelenskyy is completely disinterested in the losses that are inflicted on Ukraine. He could care less. He doesn't care how many Ukrainian men and women die in action or by virtue of simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time under these strikes. He's not going to do anything as long as he continues to receive cash in any form, much of which he pockets, obviously, along with his friends, as well as equipment that he can either use or resell on the black market, which they've done a lot of. He's going to continue the war. So I think the bad news is this is not going to work. I don't care if you call it a counter-terrorist operation, the special military operation. You've got to march into Kiev and crush these people once and for all. Now, once that happens, I think that's game over. Now, I'm sure that he and others are afraid that if they do that, it could provoke U.S. European military intervention. I don't think so. I don't think the U.S. is in any position to do anything, and without us, the Europeans can't. So I think it's time to resolve this thing, and that's what, if I were sitting there, that's what I would tell the president.
Yeah, and we're going to touch on some of that in just a minute, because there are a lot of people saying exactly that on the Russian side. And then the big question is going to come in, can they perform that on the ground? And let me not jump ahead of myself, but let's stick with the guy you were talking about, Volodymyr Zelenskyy. We said on the show a week ago, and I think you and I've said this probably dozens of times over the many months and maybe even years, that Zelenskyy is detached from reality and is not a negotiating partner. Trump cannot talk to him. He can't deal with him because he can't be rational. And the latest proof came this just a few days ago on ABC News, when Zelenskyy said that he was asked if he believes that Trump is right, that Russia's winning the war. Here's how he put it.
President also telling me he would like more communications with President Trump, saying there are people who communicate with the president more than me, and they deliver different messages to him. Does President Trump believe that Russia is winning this war, do you think?
Yes. It's not true. It's not a victory when you really spend 1 million people.
Now, one of the things that really bothered me about this, and I know you'll probably tell me it shouldn't, because, what else you think they're going to do, is that this is ABC News. This isn't just some, YouTube channel, which kind of we are, and we actually do this. But she didn't ask him any follow-up questions. She didn't press back and saying, wait a minute, how do you say Russia isn't winning when? And she could fill in the blank with a lot of things. What is your observation of why at this late stage there's still the unwillingness to challenge Zelenskyy?
Well, Martha Raddatz is a supporter of what Zelensky's doing, of what Netanyahu is doing, and supports anybody that wants to make war on China. I mean, that's her job. That's what she's part of. She's part of this mainstream media cabal. You can shift from Fox to NBC to ABC to anybody you want. You're going to get the same outcome. What you're referring to is something that has been missing in American media for a very long time. It's what the British called the second question. There is no second question, as you point out. Nobody follows up and says, well, Mr. Zelenskyy, you say that this is what the president's being told, and you say it's not right. Show us how you are winning. Give us evidence for winning. Define victory. Now, having said all of that, victory is something that I think the Russians have had difficulty defining. And that's why I go back to what I said before. Victory is the elimination of Zelenskyy and this crowd of criminals in Kiev. That's it. They've got to go away. And they're not going to get into their planes and try to fly to Miami to their new residence or to Israel or somewhere else. So you're going to have to go in there and get them. And I don't think it's beyond the means of the Russian military at all. I think they're really in a very strong position. They can do pretty much what they want, but they have to make up their minds, because without that, there can be no genuine victory, if you will. Victory is an end state. That means the enemy stops fighting. Ultimately, if you're a Russian, there's no more fighting going on. It ends.
Yeah.
How do you get there? You got to get rid of the Zelenskyy regime.
Yeah. And I mean, just militarily, even if you take the emotions out of it, I mean, you can't have the guy who's this detached from reality still in office when this comes to it. There's no reason why anybody in Russia would ever agree to a negotiated settlement. And they are still interested in a negotiated settlement, interestingly. Let me get to that in a second. But there's one more thing about Zelenskyy I want to talk about, because if Raddatz didn't ask any follow-up questions of Zelenskyy, she did give him a chance to again challenge Trump.
With all due respect to President Trump, Zelenskyy says, I think it's just his personal opinion. Trust me, we understand the Russians much better, the mentality of the Russians, than the Americans understand the Russians. I know for sure Putin doesn't want to stop the war.
We'll get to his question in just a second, but this is the latest of many times where Zelenskyy, even going back before that famous explosion in the Oval Office in February, where he directly challenges Trump and says, yeah, he doesn't understand. He's a Putin stooge. He said that before. He's as a subject of misinformation by the Russian side. And now he just doesn't understand. We understand, meaning Trump should just forget about what he says and do what Zelenskyy says. And I just got to ask, Trump prides himself on being this strong type A alpha male kind of person, but why does he keep allowing Zelenskyy to do this?
Well, I think there are a lot of people that claim to be alpha males or want to be alpha males, but there aren't really that many alpha males out there. Let's be frank. So I don't know about that. I think a good example of this whole thing is your fellow Texan McCall, who recently went into a meeting and came out of it and said, we've got to fight this war to the finish against these evil Russians for all intents and purposes and send more money to Ukraine. I mean, good Lord. What is he talking about? Again, you've got to look at his bank account. Who's filling it up? When you look at Martha Raddatz, who works for her? Who does she work for? Who pays her? That's all it's about. Everybody in the sort of Washington media community is all on the payroll for somebody. Nobody's out there telling the truth unless somebody's paying them to say it. And what you and I call the truth and what they say is the truth are entirely distinct and unrelated. So at this point, I don't think we should be surprised by any of it. This is going to go on, as I said, until the Russians end it. They have the power to end this thing once and for all. Now, there's something else I wanted to mention. It was pointed out to me by someone who's a much more astute observer of these things than I am. When Lindsey Graham and this man, Richard Blumenthal, the former Marine reservist who claimed he'd been in Vietnam and never was near it, and the combat lawyer, the two of them were standing in front of a picture or a painting, and it showed the caves beneath the monastery and cathedral in Kiev. These caves have a specific name and a specific meaning in Christian Orthodox theology and in Russian national history. And by positioning these two people that want this war to go on until Russia is destroyed, they were in front of this, and the subliminal message with this painting was, We will destroy this if we have to, but we won't give up. And I think that's probably why Zelenskyy put them in front of it. Remember, they've gone to great lengths to suppress the Orthodox Christian Church of Russia inside Ukraine, and treated everybody associated with it as a traitor and an enemy and so forth. So putting them there meant nothing to us in the West. I didn't pick up on it, obviously. But anybody who knows the history of the region and Kiev and Orthodox Christianity saw this. There was a very clear message. We will all destroy everything that is here before we give up. And that's why I think President Putin has to face the reality that he's got to intervene and smash these people once and for all. And I understand his reticence to do so. He wants to avoid this. And I understand that he's still concerned about potential U.S. intervention. I don't see it at this point. I really don't. But we can talk about why I don't really fear that at this point in other settings.
And you know, the disagreement or the lack or the unwillingness to move into reality among NATO is I just still is puzzling to me. Here is Mark Rutte talking about how just ignoring all of the combat realities that you've written about in so many books about how national combat power is made and doing a balance of power assessment between two combatant forces, etc. Ignoring all that and still says stuff like this.
We are facing the most dangerous security environment in decades. Russia's war of aggression continues. Terrorist threats persist. We are not at war, but we are not at peace either. So we must continue to strengthen our deterrence and defense. And that means pivoting towards a full warfighting readiness.
You know, I mean, you can want to do that, but I mean, if you just look at the defense industrial base alone, you said, I think last time you were on our show, you said it would be probably 10 years of sustained effort to even start to make a measurable difference. And they're talking about in 4 years. So what accounts for this lack of understanding or unwillingness to acknowledge it?
A combination of ignorance and I suppose you have to add to it unreasonable and inaccurate self-assessment. One of the things that we don't do well, and this is something the Russians do very well, by the way, Dan, but we don't self-assess. We don't look at ourselves objectively. You know, I can mention 1,000 different instances. And that's what you're hearing with Rutte. Rutte is somebody who probably privately is quite confident that he and NATO, this fracturing and dying alliance, will never be challenged. And so he can say whatever he likes. That's what it boils down to. Say whatever you like. It doesn't make any difference. No one will ever challenge you. Well, I think in this case, he's probably right. The Russians don't want a war with NATO. They're not going to challenge any of it. But we have to look at the reality. And the reality is that, sure, it would take 10 years to build the kind of military power that's required to even cope with the Russians if they had to fight them. But more important, I think there's a complete failure to understand the nature of the societies in the West that he's addressing. Nobody there is interested in fighting anybody. I mean, if you called for volunteers in the Netherlands to fight in Ukraine, you know, who would show up? You know, 15 people, 10 people. It's a joke. So he's a hot air balloon. And I think that Putin knows that eventually what happens with hot air balloons, the air comes out and the balloon collapses. That's coming. May not come as fast as he would like. And certainly I wish it would happen a lot faster because I think Europe's desperately in need of new leadership. Yeah. But for the moment, you know, the hot air balloon still floats in the corner, and that's what he's doing. And he's saying stupid things. And unfortunately, you still have a lot of people, particularly, I would argue, in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Scandinavia, Finland, where people still believe too much of what their government-controlled media say. It's tragic. It's this sort of culturally ingrained, well, the state says it must be right. Really? You know, I'm an American like you. I would think any reasonable Texan If they said, well, the government says you got to do this, a reasonable Texan would say, the hell I do. I'm a Texan. I'm going to damn well do what I think is right. So you got to prove it to me. I mean, that to me is very American. That's the way I tend to think. And, there's so much nonsense on the street that passes for reality. I think a lot of Americans are a little more sober-minded. But in Europe, it's a big problem in those countries. And
it really is. And I want to go, you talk about hot air balloons. Hot air balloons also love to go together because then they can have more fun and hold up things, the fiction, if you want to. So Ruta also went with Keir Starmer and met with him in 10 Downing. And he's going to talk about something here that the NATO alliance is the best military alliance in the history of the world.
We see NATO as the cornerstone of our defense. The most effective military alliance the world has ever seen, as has been proven over 18 years. And the task of the summit, obviously, is to make sure that we ensure that for decades to come, it serves exactly that same purpose. And you'll have seen our strategic defence review last week, which had a number of principles, but one of which was NATO first. Yes. So as we discussed this afternoon, our preparations for the summit, which is crucially important, I think, historic moment as we go forward in what we've called a new era for defence and security.
A new era, and the best in history. And I immediately said, hang on, Afghanistan? Was that a big NATO victory? Was what we've done in the last 3.5 years a big Ukraine victory supported by NATO? I mean, everywhere you want to look, Doug, there is tangible physical wreckage of our failures militarily. And then he wants to sit there and just repeat that canard that it's like a bumper sticker they've been talking about for years. Yeah. Do you think that there are people that think the way you and I do when they hear that, or do they just reflexively go, yeah, it's the best one in history?
I think there are more people that are in the latter camp, unfortunately, in Europe than we would like. It's sort of like saying, well, I've been examined every year for the last 10 years, and they have not found any evidence for crippling disease. Therefore, I will live forever. Well, we know that's nonsense. None of us are going to live forever just because they haven't found something wrong for 10 years. Well, NATO has never really been challenged to do much of anything. And NATO was always dragged kicking and screaming, because I watched it, into things that they didn't want to be part of. I saw that with the Balkans.
Oh, yeah. I wonder if I'm sorry, I meant to actually ask you about that, because I just gave these other two examples. But how did you see NATO from the inside at the highest levels? How did you see it perform in the Balkans?
Well, first of all, there was no stomach under any circumstances for a direct military confrontation with anyone. That meant that until you had agreement from your opponent, in the case of the Balkans, it was the Yugoslav government, or the Serbs for all intents and purposes. Nobody was willing to fight their way in to Kosovo or anywhere else to, quote unquote, liberate Kosovo or install anybody. There was no stomach for it. So first thing you had to do is bomb everybody for 78 days. And finally, the Serbs were told by the Russians, well, we're not going to support you. We can't. It's beyond our ability. This is back in 1999, when Russia was in very, very serious trouble. Yeah. And we also bribed them. I mean, that's another story. We promised the Russians billions of dollars. I don't know if it was ever delivered. But the point is, we sent over there during the air campaign an envoy, and he said, if you'll stop, we'll do X, Y, and Z. So ultimately, there was no fighting, because the Serbs said, well, if we can't get fuel and food during the winter, then we'll starve to death. So temporarily, we will give up Kosovo. We'll march home. We'll take our troops out. So they did. That didn't mean they renounced Kosovo, which was part of the Serbian homeland. They didn't come to any sort of conclusion like that. They simply said, we can't stay here and sustain this conflict because we won't have any food or fuel. Now, why is that important? Because that's when the Europeans expressed their willingness to send troops. In other words, we'll join the Kosovo support force. In other words, this force that would come in and establish peace and end the fighting. Well, what it really meant was that we're going to take over various sectors with Europeans and non-Europeans who have agreed to join this coalition of the willing. You've heard that before, inside NATO, because not everybody in NATO wanted to go. I mean, if you're sitting in Spain, you look at this and say, why would I want to go there and do that?
Yeah.
If you're somewhere else sitting in Finland or Sweden or Denmark or whatever, you may or may not want to go for different reasons. And then you had people that said, well, I'm willing to send a battalion, but I'm not sending anything else. So then you had to get larger nations to group smaller entities with their respective brigades. The Germans did that, for example. The British brought in Norwegians with them. We had a brigade and we brought in others with us. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that this thing called NATO is a facade. It's not real. And if anybody decided to challenge it, it would crack like a house of glass.
Yeah.
That's
my worry, but it could well be what you said a minute ago about why Mark Rutte, Keir Starmer say these things, because they don't think it will ever be challenged. So they are free to say anything if they're right. But let's almost hope that they are right, because there is a risk if they're not. And I've talked about a lot of the Europeans and the Ukrainian leaders. Let's take a look at the Russian side of this, because they have a stake in this as well, as you might guess. There was a week ago, last Monday, I guess, in Istanbul, the second meeting that the Russian and Ukraine side had in direct conversations. And Russia brought what they called a memo at first, which was a 12-point plan, which was, when you look at it, effectively surrender terms, because nobody would be able to agree to that on the Ukraine side, because you have to give up everything. You have to say no NATO. You have to say no denazification. You have to get rid of your military, all kinds of things, in addition to the territory, et cetera, withdraw from areas where you currently control willingly, et cetera. And so after that, that was so a week ago Monday. Then you had Peskov, and I think this was just last night. He was asked about the current situation with NATO, talking about they're going to up-arm and rearm Europe, et cetera, and that they're going to continue to support the Ukraine side. And he was asked in Russian media, where are you on this?
Russia abides by the agreements reached during the second round of negotiations in Istanbul and always implements them. The same cannot be said for Ukraine. We have seen and heard numerous excuses, but they are far from convincing. Russia remains committed to implementing the agreements reached in Istanbul. Hungarian Prime Minister Orban has always been, and still is, firmly committed to solving the most difficult issues through dialogue. His position clearly stands in stark contrast to the short-sighted stance of most EU leaders. Russia and Hungary do not necessarily agree on everything. We have many differences. Nevertheless, our mutual willingness to discuss the most acute and sensitive issues at the negotiating table allows us to resolve these issues more effectively.
Now, that was yesterday by Peskov, and then I think it was the day before you had Medvedev, the former Russian president and prime minister, and he says that there's a couple things you need to understand. This is back on June 3rd. He said, our army is actively advancing and will continue to advance. Everything that must explode will certainly explode. This is in response to the attack on the Russian bomber fleet. Those who must be exterminated will disappear. The negotiations in Istanbul are needed not for a compromise peace on unrealistic conditions invented by someone, but for our speedy victory and the complete destruction of the neo-Nazi government. That is as sharp and direct a statement as you can get, that we're not interested in a negotiated settlement that leaves Kiev in power, or the Zelenskyy regime in power. So, I mean, I think all that together says we'll negotiate as long as you surrender on that 12-point plan. But otherwise, it looks like they are set and are in the process of moving on until they go to Kiev, as you said.
Well, remember, when they met in April of 2022, what the Russians were interested in were things that were far, far more reasonable than the list that you've just shown. In other words, at that time, they were looking at limited territorial acquisition, and they wanted reassurances or security assurances that there would be no NATO membership. They wanted neutrality, but it was a very different agreement from what you just saw. All right, so this is what, 3.5 years later, and what are we dealing with? Well, we're dealing with effectively what you're describing: unconditional submission to these terms, or the war continues. And what are you supposed to say? I mean, are you going to take the word of some organization that dresses up like Nazis, commits atrocities against Russian citizens in the name of Ukrainian nationalism and NATO, and a group of people sitting in West European capitals and in the United States who say, here's more money, harm Russians, kill Russians? I mean, stop and think about that. When President Trump spoke with President Putin, there was some discussion of the attack on the Tupolev bombers that damaged them. And I think President Trump conveyed the impression that he was unaware of the details of that. Well, that may or may not have been true. We know that, at least according to several sources in the media, President Trump has had roughly 14 intelligence briefings in which he actually sat there and listened since he took office. Well, that's really remarkably few. Most presidents are keenly interested in the intelligence briefing that frequently many of them got every day, sometimes 3 times a week, but certainly more than 14 times since January. So it may be that President Trump was unaware of the details, and I doubt seriously that he understood the implications under the strategic arms limitation talks. So I think President Putin listened and he reached certain conclusions. Said, okay, let's give him the benefit of the doubt, and he didn't know. Then we're in a lot of trouble because the president doesn't know what the hell is going on. And then secondly, it's pretty clear that the president doesn't control much. He doesn't have that much influence. The people that seem to have all the influence are people like Graham and Blumenthal. So we've got a Congress that seems to be operating independently of the White House. And oh, by the way, why would the president allow these people to conduct foreign policy on behalf of the country when they are absolutely not empowered to do so? So if you're a Russian right now, you say, we can't trust anything that we are told. We can't bet on anyone holding up their quote unquote end of the deal. And so what are we going to have to do? Well, we've got to press ahead. My only concern with pressing ahead at this stage is the decisiveness involved in the ultimate outcome and the end state. What do you want this to look like when it's over? That's a question we never asked in Vietnam. We never asked it in Iraq or anywhere else. We have to ask that question, and they need to ask that question. I don't think they can live with a government in Kiev that has anything to do with Zelenskyy and the people who are there. So what are they going to do about it? Because unless they're willing to go in there and root these people out, they will sit there indefinitely because people from the United States will send them money, as will people in Western Europe.
Yeah, with the partisan activity that was even talked about before the war started and has come back up again here in recent months. So there's no question that would happen, which gives more impetus to the Russian side to do exactly what you suggest, because it would almost be counterproductive. It would nearly be foolish to stop short of that, knowing that you're going to eat that as a future condition.
Well, if I could just add one point.
Yeah,
on
sure.
Odessa is the place that you absolutely, if you're a Russian, must regain control of, because Odessa is the gateway for arms and everything else that you can think of, as well as exporting Ukrainian grain. So why leave Odessa in the hands of your opponent, your enemy? No, you probably want to make whatever remains of Ukraine a landlocked rump state, because a landlocked rump state is probably not going to threaten you very much. I mean, in Poland, we just elected a new president, and that's a very positive thing. And this man Nawrocki has made it very clear that he doesn't want war with Russia. He wants an end to it. The Polish people don't want anything to do with it. Neither do the Slovaks or the Hungarians. These are people that border Russia. I dare say that if you can do it in Romania and go out and get accurate polling data, they are all overwhelmingly opposed to war with Russia. That leaves you with Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. And recently, they've been on the lunatic fringe. And they talk as though they are sitting on top of NATO's nuclear arsenal, ready to launch at any moment. They're crazy. And no one in their right mind is going to support them, ever. What they should be told by Washington is, look, we like you, and we'll help you in whatever ways we can, but you've got to get along with your neighbors. You know, you've got Russians living there. Get along with them. It's a fact of life. But everybody else that borders Russia, pretty much figured out this is a disaster. We haven't even talked about Moldova. And the Russians are going to send, 10,000 more troops to Moldova to protect the Russians that are settled there. Well, just look at the map. Where's Moldova? Where is Odessa? Well,
Right.
come on. This is all going to end up in Russian hands. The Ukrainian government, with our backing, has had an opportunity repeatedly over many years now to reach an agreement. They have steadfastly refused to do so. President Trump has begun finally to recognize this truth, that this man Zelenskyy is not going to do anything that he wants him to do.
Yeah.
Now, whether or not he can persuade the intelligence services to see to it that this man is removed, I don't know. I can't even speculate about that. I have no background in it. But I think it's time for him to understand that if he really wants this war to end and the killing to stop any more aid to Ukraine. Pull out all the U.S. military, non-military, intelligence, civilians, whatever is there. Anybody who's an American citizen, get out of Ukraine. When he does that, it's over.
Right.
That's what he needs to understand. It's done, because the Europeans can't replace that. They can't make up for the difference in the loss of resources and capability.
Yeah, and you mentioned a second ago, or actually earlier in this show, that there's very few people in Europe that would be willing to go fight against Russia for any reason at all, because they don't see that they're threatened. One of those is you also mentioned a minute ago, is Hungary. But you also heard Peskov mention specifically Slovakia and Hungary, say we don't agree with them on everything, but at least they're willing to have negotiated dialogue to where we can end, as opposed to the Starmers and the Rutas, etc. But here is something that Orban said, that they have bigger issues than a war with Ukraine. I'm sorry, with the war with Russia, because he views this, like apparently Trump did, that the war is already over, it's already lost. So I want to move on to bigger issues, which is this.
Mes amis, nous n'allons pas baisser le bras, pointer du doigt à Bruxelles et au droit international comme des perdants. Nous nous agissons. Ce qui se passe, ce n'est pas une migration. C'est un échange organisé de populations pour remplacer le socle culturel de l'Europe. Nous ne mettrons pas à genoux devant Bruxelles. Nous nous tenons du côté des citoyens et nous nous battrons pour eux. Nous nous battons pour les familles et pour la patrie, et si nécessaire, contre toute l'armée bruxelloise de bureaucrates. 1 million d'euros par jour, pour nous, c'est beaucoup d'argent. Pourtant, nous préférons plutôt payer que de laisser entrer qui que ce soit illégalement. C'est le meilleur investissement pour l'avenir.
So Viktor Orban, for those who may not have been able to read the fine text at the bottom of it, he says, I'm not worried about a war with Russia. I have no interest in that. I'm worried about the pressure I'm getting from Brussels to make us change our immigration policies in ways that are antithetical to our country as he sees it. So he's saying, I'm not going to bow to Brussels. So if you're looking for European unity, this ain't it.
Well, it may be interesting for the audience to know that President Trump has recently told the Serbs that they should open their doors and allow who knows how many hundreds of thousands of Africans, Arabs, and other people from the Middle East and North Africa into Serbia. The Serbs, of course, they like us. They want to get along with us, but they think that's insane. Well, of course it's insane. And that's what Orban thinks. And I think the balance is tipping in favor of people who've said, wait a minute, we have a war right here at home. I mean, if you go to Great Britain right now, which I think may well be even worse than France in some ways, although the French have serious problems. It's gotten to the point where people that are not British who live in Britain but claim citizenship or don't claim citizenship, even if they're illegal, all have rights and privileges that British people don't. In other words, if you open your mouth and you object to someone who doesn't speak English or refuses to, if you raise objections to things like rape gangs and other kinds of heinous crimes being committed by people who are not British, then you're a racist and you have to be punished and dealt with severely. That's Mr. Starmer. You know, this is what Mr. Starmer has brought to Great Britain. I think it was the historian, Dr. Starkey, used to teach, I think, at Oxford or Cambridge, I don't remember which, who pointed out the other day that Starmer and his predecessor, Tony Blair, had done more damage to Great Britain than the Second World War did. I mean, this is where they are in Europe right now. Just look at France. How many knifings and murders occur on a routine basis? In Germany, the German government clamps down on the police, and they don't report what goes on. When little boys are picked up at events in Germany, we used, you've been to them. We used to call them fests, where you would go to the local festival that was in a village, and a group of people from North Africa, the Middle East, or somewhere else gang rape a little boy. Well, you can't report that. You can't say that. Well, why not? It's true. These things have been going on for too long. And what Orban is saying is true. We have a war that we have to win here at home. That is the war for us, for our culture, our way of life, our national identity. And if that makes us racist, then I don't care. You can call us what you like, but we Hungarians are going to be here. Yeah, here's a funny story that your audience may appreciate. 1968, believe it or not. I was 15. I was in Hungary, and I had just begun studying some German. This is a year before I went there as an exchange student. And I was standing out in front of the American embassy. And there were these photographs that had been posted on things like telephone poles and placards that showed various kinds of atrocities being committed in Vietnam by us against the Vietnamese. And of course, remember, at that point, Hungary was a Soviet satellite, was still under Soviet occupation. And I struck up this conversation with a Hungarian looking at the picture. I said, "Do you believe it?" And he sort of shrugged and said, "Maybe, maybe not." And then I said, "Well, when will the Soviets leave that are here in your country?" He said, "Oh, they'll leave." I said, "Are you sure?" He said, "Absolutely." He said, "Look, the Turks were here for 300 years and they are gone and we are still here." I loved that guy. He was a Hungarian and that was his view. The Turks were here for 300 years. These Soviets will be here, but eventually they'll all go and we will survive. This is our country. And I think that's Europe. And more European leaders are going to hear that from their people.
Right.
And we need to wake up. And President Trump certainly should not be telling the Serbs to open the floodgates to the crime wave that will enter their country if they allow these people in great numbers. It's going to cost them more than €1 million a day. And by the way, President Trump needs to keep up with the news. We have 50 million people in this country that aren't legal. 30 million came in while Biden was there. So what about us?
Right. And in fact, I want to shift gears here in the last section of the show today to the United States, because there are some both international and domestic issues which are eating away at the foundation, really in the way that you're talking about here. First of all, I want to start off, we're still talking about NATO support, but now we're looking at our northern frontier of Canada. Now, the new Prime Minister Carney says, yeah, we're going to support Ukraine. We're going to support NATO expansion, but with an important new caveat.
Our plan will help ensure that Canada is strong at home and reliable abroad. We will ensure that every dollar is invested wisely, including by prioritizing made-in-Canada manufacturing and supply chains. We should no longer send 3/4 of our defense capital spending to America.
So that's a pretty big shift right there, because both Europe and Canada have spent a significant portion of their defense spend on American weaponry and on ammunition and all that kind of stuff. And now then, I mean, you saw Orban standing up for Hungarians, and now you see the Canadian guy standing up for Canadians. I mean, he kind of wants to be neighbors, but he's changing course here. And how do you see that developing up in the north, first of all?
Howard Lutnick was in a meeting with the representatives from India, and the meeting was about trade with India. And one of the Indian representatives said to Mr. Lutnick, "You don't seem very happy with us. What would make you happier? What can we do that would make you happy?" And he said, "Well, you could buy more of our military equipment instead of Russian military equipment." Stop and think about that. What do we actually export? What do we build and manufacture? Well, we have energy, which we can export. We have food. We still have a tremendous agricultural sector in this country. We produce wheat and a whole range of other things. And then we have military equipment. That's it. The thing that's disturbing is that he would say to the Indian, well, we'd like you to buy our equipment instead of Russia's. Well, Russia is nearby. And people always have to think in terms of how far do I have to go to get the repair parts?
Yep.
And how can I be certain that they will arrive? And by the way, the United States has a bad habit of punishing anybody it does business with whenever it likes. Oh, I'm sorry, we don't like what you did last night. Your human rights record isn't quite what we think it should be. Boom, we're not shipping. So, we're not a reliable partner. And I'm not a big fan of this new Canadian Prime Minister, but his views resonate. There's no question about it with me. And I think that we should be far more interested in what happens here than we are in what's going on in the rest of the world. But, we're in the last days of, what would you call it, Dan? Fading empire?
That is my concern. Yeah. And, it's used to be that Canada and Mexico would be something close to subservient to the United States. They wouldn't challenge us on anything of any substance here. But so you see Carney, and he did kind of a little bit to Trump in the Oval Office when he met a month or so ago. And then now on our southern border, you have a Mexican senator. Now, he's not official of the, he's not in charge of anything in the government. He's a senator, just like, Lindsey Graham is free to bloviate and say whatever he wants, but that's not American policy. But still, the fact that he's going to say what I'm about to show you is eye-opening.
Yo dije, si hacemos el muro, sí lo pagamos, pero lo hacemos con el mapa de México en 1830. Este es lo que era Estados Unidos en 1830. Y esto era parte de México, no era todo México. Si ustedes pueden ver, quizás un tercio, mínimo una cuarta parte del territorio norteamericano era parte de México hasta 1846.
What do you make of that, Doug? Is that anything we should be concerned about, or is it just some Mexican member of their Senate that's saying stuff that we really don't care about?
Well, I'm sure you've been to Mexico. I have. And if you visit, this is not unusual. There is this long memory in Mexico of how we took advantage of them and grabbed all of this territory as a result of the Mexican War in 1846. In some respects, he's correct. But what people don't understand is that in that territory that he was pointed to, which became part of the United States, there were a few 100,000 people, more than half of whom were Indian tribes. And by the way, they invited the so-called Anglos to settle in northern Texas. Initially, this is the Mexican government because they wanted them to take the brunt of the Indian attacks and interventions into northern Mexico, where they would raid and steal things and so forth. Little did they know it would become Texas, but that's what happened, obviously. I think we should be very concerned in this sense that we have millions and millions and millions of Mexicans and many other Hispanics inside the United States, many of whom don't seem to feel as though they're Americans. And then we have millions that do. But the numbers that don't has jumped dramatically over the last few years. And when I say few years, I'm not just talking about the last 4 or 5. I'd go all the way back to the 90s. Sam Huntington wrote a wonderful book, and this is the last book that he wrote. It was called Who Are We? And the book opens in the first chapter with a soccer game in Los Angeles. And the soccer game, this stadium of 20 or 30,000 fills up. And it's between the United States and Mexico. And there are perhaps 500 people there rooting for America, and everybody else in the stadium is cheering for Mexico. And he essentially asks the same question you are. Is this something we should be concerned about? This was in the 1990s, Dan. This is now 2025. No one could miss the numbers of Mexican flags that we saw flying in Los Angeles recently.
Right.
And I'm not insisting that this is the beginning of a major conflict. What I'm suggesting is that we're seeing perhaps the the spring rain before the flood. All societies are tested. And there are two ways that you can be tested. One is war, and I don't think that's likely for us because we have the advantage of being fairly isolated here in the Western Hemisphere. We can walk out of these so-called vital conflicts anytime we want with no impact on us at all, and very little impact overseas. But we can't survive the financial crisis that looms on the horizon right now very easily. And when people no longer can be subsidized, whether it's food stamps or other special privileges or gifts of cash or opportunities that are government financed and provided, when that goes away and you have millions of people inside your country who are not Americans and make it abundantly clear that they don't want to be Americans, that they are in fact loyal to other entities, then you got a real problem. And I think we've gotten a foretaste of it in LA. It's just the beginning. How we handle these things in the months ahead, particularly as we go from this state of abundance that you and I have known throughout most of our lives to a state of scarcity. You know, what happens when everything you normally buy at the Food Lion or Winn-Dixie is no longer on the shelves? What do you do when you can't afford whatever it is that you want, whether it's a car or gasoline or anything else? I mean, we haven't had to deal with this for a long time. I vaguely remember it in the 1970s. But all of these things have to be taken into account. So I think the question is, who are we, is a very good one and a very important one. And I'm not sure at this stage that we can answer that very easily.
And before we came on the air here, you were talking to me about some other aspects of these riots in LA that you've been concerned about. The way most of the media is portraying this is that there's lots of, and that's part of it is accurate, that there's a lot of pro-immigrant views in California, and that they didn't like the way that they were handled, and they didn't like that the ICE agents came in looking like they're dressed for war, et cetera, like they were soldiers, not policemen, et cetera. But then you're suggesting that there may be others behind all these protests, more than just people and who, however legitimate, that have different agendas in there. What is your position on that?
Well, the chief of police in Los Angeles tried to make the argument that the vast majority of people involved in this activity, the destruction of private property and threatening people's lives, were in fact what he called professional anarchists. I'm sure some of that is true. And we do have evidence because we saw this in 2020. There are wealthy so-called oligarchs, you know, people that we always talk about, Soros, who has money that goes through many, many different front organizations, but he's not the only one. And
by the way, Doug, just as you're talking here, what we're seeing on the screen there that Gary found this morning is somebody has a lot of money to buy these bionic shield masks that are handed out en masse to just protesters. That doesn't look like some sort of just grew up from the grassroots that suddenly they came out there and someone provided these. It means they had to have them to give them out. So that by itself is kind of concerning.
Oh, no, absolutely. And this is, as I said before, this is the tip of the proverbial iceberg. And I would expect these kinds of things to get progressively worse as you go through the summer and into the fall, simply because of the strain that the financial crisis is likely to impose on our society. It's this issue of societal cohesion. So there's no doubt some of that is true, but then there's something else that's concerning, and it's the fact that this chief of police in LA said, I will not cooperate, and no one in my department will cooperate with any federal authorities. Well, the chief of police, I think, is an American citizen. And if you're an American citizen and the president of the United States determines that conditions warrant the use of federal troops, I would think that you would present yourself for not just cooperation, but also to provide advice. But this is the other thing that we need to understand. Back in the early 1960s, we go back to 62, 63, 64, Los Angeles was, as I recollect, 90% white. Today, it's less than 33% white. Now, why is this important? Because there are racial divisions in this country, and those divisions can easily be exploited by the kind of people who purchase those masks. And hatred is easy to mobilize and whip up. And unfortunately, that's the other thing that I fear. The same people that provided those expensive masks, they're going to be providing other things, weapons. Sometimes those are bricks. Sometimes those are stones. I mean, I'm sure you saw the clip that was on the television from Los Angeles of this man standing there throwing bricks at passing police cars. Well, my first question is, why didn't one of the police cars stop and then try to arrest this man, or better yet, shoot him? Well, we don't shoot people. Well, I got news for you. The only way to stop looting of stores, which, by the way, we've also seen in Los Angeles again, looting and the destruction of private property, if you don't shoot someone who is doing that sort of thing, it won't stop.
Yeah, and you can just see this is right there. That's the one. That's kind of the money shot right there. That is, it's not a gun, but you could have killed somebody if that brick goes through the driver's window right there. All these are doing it. I mean, you can't use more force than is required by the police really across the country, but you have to use force when it is required. And this just emboldens these. I hesitate to even call them protesters, because these are just violent people who seem to be having a good time about attacking the police than they do about protesting whatever policies that ICE may have been doing. So I think but the problem is, though, Doug, this is a really, really chaotic and multifaceted issue that doesn't have any easy answers, because there is so much hatred on many sides of this. How do you solve that?
Well, you don't solve the hatred, but you have to stop the disorder. If you don't compel people to obey the law, if you don't make it abundantly clear that if they do certain things, they risk being shot and killed.
Doug, I want to ask you something, because something just occurred to me that I remember you told me, I bet it's close to 30 years ago, that one of America's most famous generals, George Patton, came up in the ranks earlier when he was putting down a protest in Washington, D.C. against a bunch of veterans. And if I recall correctly, I'm 30 years in the past, so maybe this isn't right, but don't I recall you saying that he did whatever it took, even though he loved the veterans, to put down the protests?
Well, he was not in charge at the time. He was a lieutenant colonel commanding a cavalry squadron. And you're talking about the bonus marchers. These were veterans who'd been promised a bonus based on their service during the First World War in Europe. The bonus was never paid. And so they decided to take to the streets. They were actually camped on the Washington Mall, up and down the mall from the Washington Monument. And the president said, we can't have this. This is anarchy inside the Capitol of the United States. And he directed MacArthur, who was the chief of staff, to remove them. And ultimately, we did that. Now, one person was killed. I think one child was injured or killed. And that was it, which is a miracle, because there was thousands and thousands of people there. But Patton and the rest of the troops that were there didn't like it. They found it distasteful because they were sympathetic to these veterans who hadn't been paid. But that represented anarchy, a threat to law and order, a threat to the chief executive of the United States and to the law and order in our country. And so they acted. That in retrospect was pretty mild compared to what you saw in Los Angeles. If we were to resurrect MacArthur and Patton and they saw what went on there, my God, I think they'd have gone through the roof right away. And my point is simply this. At some points you have to come up with the right rules of engagement. You can't do what Pam Bondi did. She came on television. Well, we found that man that was throwing those bricks, and we're going to go search his apartment. Thank you, Attorney General. You're the same Attorney General that won't release the lists of Epstein's clients. Well done. We're so grateful to you for your failure to enforce the law in Washington. Now you want to arrest this one man. Come on, this stuff is not going to be dealt with nicely. It's not going to produce the desired outcome. And these are the things that the president is going to have to wrestle with. And it's tough. All of us, you and I that served in the military, we all find the idea of being employed to restore order domestically tasteful. But if we can't do it, we have no country.
Right. That's the point that has to be made. That's why I was bringing up the Patton issue, because he's one of the most beloved American generals in our history. And yet when it came time to preserving the domestic stability, he did the distasteful because that was needed. And I think that we're in a similar situation right here. We've got to get control of this, whether it's state. I would be great if we could have the state, the local, and the federal officials working cooperatively together for the general good. But as you just pointed out, there's problems in Washington, there's problems in California, and this is a bigger issue that's going to have to be addressed.
Well, by the way, if you go back and look at the photographs that were taken at the time that this bonus march was dispersed, there's a lieutenant colonel standing next to General MacArthur as chief of staff, and that's Eisenhower, who at the time was advising him on quote unquote public relations. And then you had, of course, Patton that walks up, gets off his horse. So it's fascinating to look at the people that were involved. There were other major names. All of these people, by the way, all of these people also served on the Mexican border and wore the Mexican campaign ribbon, because the Mexican border was not a friendly place to us then either in the 1920s and 30s. So what we've got to do is we've got to make some decisions. Are we going to tolerate all of these foreign flags on our soil? You know, I'm tired of seeing foreign flags flown left and right inside our country as evidence for some sort of legitimate political entity. We're Americans. The last time I looked, there's one flag. That's it. I don't know why the others are out there. We put the others out for visiting dignitaries as a matter of courtesy. When a president from some country, whether it's Liberia or Mexico or Russia, we fly their flags. But otherwise, why are we seeing all of these foreign flags? It's not a good thing. Yeah.
Well, listen, this is obviously not going away anytime soon. So we really, really appreciate you weighing in on these two really big issues that we've discussed today. And as always, we're very grateful for your time.
Hey, thank you, Dan.
And we appreciate you guys too. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't done that already. It helps us out more than you know. We really appreciate you guys. And we're going to continue to give you whatever's happening, because we tell you we are unintimidated and uncompromising. We will bring you the truth, even when it's tough and difficult, like what's happening here inside the United States or within NATO in Europe. Thank you very much. We'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.